The simulator's red warning lights bathed Captain Cassidy Rhodes in crimson as she demonstrated emergency procedures to her students. "When everything goes wrong at 30,000 feet, she said calmly, your training becomes your lifeline." The young pilots nodded respectfully, but their eyes held that familiar look, polite attention tinged with quiet skepticism. After all, she was just an instructor now. 3 years of teaching had dimmed the legend of Valkyrie 01 in their minds, reducing her to routine briefings and classroom theory. Before we dive into Cassidy's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments. Are you tuning in from home, work, or somewhere special? Now, let's discover how legends are truly made. The morning sun streamed through the flight training facility windows as Captain Cassidy Rhodes adjusted the instrument panel display. 24 junior pilots sat in neat rows, notebooks open, pens ready. The same routine she'd followed for 3 years now. "Today we're covering instrument approach procedures in zero visibility conditions," she announced, her voice steady and professional. "Lieutenant Morrison, what's your first priority when you lose visual contact with the runway?" Morrison straightened in his chair. "Maintain heading and altitude, ma'am." "Trust your instruments." "Correct." "And why is that critical?" "Because panic kills faster than equipment failure, ma'am." Cassidy nodded. "Good. Remember that." She clicked to the next slide showing a cockpit view obscured by thick fog. "In combat zones, weather isn't your only enemy. You might have hostiles tracking you while you're flying blind." The students scribbled notes dutifully. She watched their faces, attentive but distant, like they were studying ancient history rather than life-saving techniques. To them, she was just another instructor who'd never seen real action. "Captain Torres, you're descending through clouds at night. Your GPS goes dark. What's your move?" Torres hesitated. "Switch to backup navigation, ma'am." "Which backup? Radio beacons? What if those are jammed?" Silence filled the room. Cassidy walked between the desks, her boots clicking on the polished floor. "You fall back on dead reckoning. Time, speed, heading. Basic math keeps you alive when technology fails." She moved to the whiteboard and drew a simple triangle. 3 years ago, I flew a rescue mission during a mountain blizzard. No GPS, no radio contact, instruments frosting over. She sketched terrain features. 47 Marines trapped in a collapsed forward base. Zero visibility for 6 hours. The students looked up from their notebooks, suddenly interested. "I used star positions and magnetic compass readings to navigate between peaks. Dead reckoning saved those lives because when everything electronic failed, basic flying skills didn't." Lieutenant Chen raised her hand. "Ma'am, is that why they call you Valkyrie?" The question hung in the air. Cassidy capped her marker slowly. Valkyries were mythological figures who decided who lived and died in battle. That day, I decided 47 Marines would live. She turned back to the board. "But mythology doesn't matter in this classroom. What matters is that you master these fundamentals so you can make the same decision when your time comes." The door at the back of the room opened quietly. General Walter Hayes stepped inside, his gray hair perfectly groomed, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. He positioned himself against the wall and crossed his arms, watching. Cassidy continued without acknowledging him, though her shoulders straightened slightly. "Lieutenant Jackson, walk me through a no-visibility approach to a hostile landing zone." Jackson cleared his throat. "Establish descent rate based on known terrain elevation. Use radio altimeter for final approach height. Maintain airspeed until ground contact. And if you're taking fire during approach, trust the instruments, ma'am. Don't deviate unless absolutely necessary." "Exactly. Fear makes you doubt your training. Doubt gets you killed." Hayes nodded approvingly from the back of the room. His presence commanded attention, but he remained silent, letting her teach. "The key to instrument flying is building habits that work under stress," Cassidy continued. "When your heart rate spikes and your hands shake, muscle memory takes over. Practice these procedures until they become automatic. She demonstrated on the simulator panel, her movements smooth and confident. Skin pattern, altitude, airspeed, heading, repeat. Never fixate on one instrument. Keep your eyes moving. Morrison raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you stay calm when everything's going wrong? Cassidy paused at the question. She glanced toward Hayes, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. You remind yourself that panicking helps nobody. The people depending on you need you focused, not afraid. Fear is normal. Letting it control you isn't. The room fell quiet except for the scratch of pens on paper. These young pilots were finally listening, really listening, to someone who'd been where they might go. Hayes straightened, checking his watch. He'd seen what he came to see. Suddenly, the emergency klaxon pierced the morning calm. The harsh, urgent tone echoed through the building as red warning lights began flashing in the hallway. All training stopped. Cassidy looked toward the door as Hayes stepped forward, his expression grave. Something big was happening. The base operations center buzzed with urgent activity. Cassidy followed General Hayes through the maze of computer terminals and communication equipment. Officers hurried between workstations, their voices clipped and professional. The emergency klaxon had stopped, but tension filled the air like static electricity. Chief Master Sergeant Eliza Ward stood at the center of it all, her weathered face illuminated by multiple screens displaying satellite imagery and tactical data. She looked up as Hayes approached with Cassidy trailing behind. General, we've got a situation, Ward began without preamble. Humanitarian convoy trapped in hostile territory. 200 civilians, including 43 children. Medical supplies critically low. Hayes moved closer to the main display screen. Show me. Ward typed rapidly, bringing up a mountain valley dotted with vehicle markers. They're pinned down in the Khorasan Pass, 12 clicks from the nearest friendly position. Enemy forces have them surrounded. A crackling radio transmission filled the room. Base, this is Corporal Nathan Briggs with the convoy. We've got wounded going critical. Antibiotics ran out 6 hours ago. We need immediate resupply or we're going to start losing people. Ward adjusted the radio volume. Roger, Corporal. We're working on it. Hang tight. The static-filled response came back weak but determined. Copy that, base. But time isn't on our side here. Hayes studied the tactical display. Red zones marked enemy positions surrounding the small blue cluster representing the convoy. What's our window? 4 hours, maybe less, Ward replied. After that, medical emergencies become casualties. Weather's moving in 2, visibility drops to 0 by nightfall. Squadron pilots began filtering into the operations center, summoned by the emergency alert. Major Collins arrived first, followed by Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Commander Brooks. Within minutes, 8 experienced pilots stood around the central display. Ward outlined the mission parameters with military precision. Single aircraft insertion through Khorasan Pass. Narrow mountain corridor, approximately 2 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Active SAM sites on both sides. Known enemy fighter patrols in the area. She highlighted the route in red on the screen. Approach altitude limited to 500 feet above ground level to avoid radar detection. No escort possible, fighters can't maneuver effectively in that terrain. Major Collins studied the display and shook his head slowly. That's a death trap. One mistake and you're scattered across the mountainside. Medical supplies are loaded and ready, Ward continued. C-130 configured for maximum cargo capacity. Landing zone is barely adequate, dirt strip with obstacles on both ends. Captain Martinez crossed his arms. What's the enemy air threat assessment? Multiple SAM batteries confirmed active. At least 6 fighter aircraft on patrol rotation. Ground forces with portable anti-aircraft weapons. The room fell quiet as the pilots absorbed the information. Hayes watched their faces carefully. Briggs, give us your status, Ward called into the radio. The radio crackled back immediately. We've got 3 kids running high fevers. Adults holding steady for now, but morale's dropping fast. They keep asking when help's coming. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was the first to speak. General, this is a suicide mission. That approach corridor gives you 0 room for error. Hayes nodded but said nothing. He continued studying the pilot's expressions. Major Collins cleared his throat. Sir, respectfully, this mission exceeds acceptable risk parameters. We'd be trading 1 life for 200, but if the aircraft gets shot down, those civilians still die. Plus we lose the pilot and the aircraft, Captain Martinez added. Strategic resources we can't afford to waste. One by one, the experienced pilots found reasons to decline. Equipment concerns. Weather factors. Tactical disadvantages. Each objection was valid, professional, and carefully reasoned. The radio interrupted their discussion. Base, this is Briggs again. One of the children just went into seizure. We need those medical supplies now. Silence filled the operations center. Hayes looked around the room at his senior pilots, all of whom avoided eye contact. Cassidy stepped forward from where she'd been standing quietly near the back. General, I'll take the mission. Every head in the room turned toward her. Major Collins spoke first. Captain, with all due respect, you haven't flown combat missions in 3 years. This isn't a training exercise. The approach parameters alone would challenge our most experienced pilots, Lieutenant Commander Brooks added. That mountain corridor is unforgiving. Captain Martinez shook his head. 1 instructor pilot against an entire enemy air defense network? It's not realistic. Cassidy kept her eyes on Hayes. Sir, those children need help. Someone has to try. Ward stepped closer to the group. She's the only pilot in this room who's actually done the impossible before. 3 years ago, she pulled 47 Marines out of conditions worse than this. That was different, Collins protested. This is a deliberate insertion into active hostile territory. Hayes raised his hand, silencing the debate. He studied Cassidy for a long moment, his weathered face showing no emotion. The operations center fell completely quiet except for the hum of electronic equipment. Chief Ward, prep Valkyrie 01 for immediate departure, Hayes said finally. His voice carried absolute authority. Load full medical supplies and survival equipment. The pilots exchanged surprised glances. Using her call sign meant this was official. Sir, are you certain about this? Major Collins asked. Hayes turned to face the room. Sometimes the right pilot isn't the one with the most recent flight hours. Sometimes it's the one who understands that some missions are worth the risk. Cassidy straightened her shoulders. Thank you, General. I won't let those people down. I know you won't, Valkyrie. That's why you're going. The flight line stretched before Cassidy like a concrete runway to judgment. Her boots echoed against the tarmac as she walked toward the waiting C-130, its massive cargo bay already loaded with medical supplies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the aircraft, but the air felt heavy with more than just heat. Ground crew members moved around the plane with practiced efficiency, but she caught their worried glances. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez checked fuel levels twice. Airman Chin inspected the cargo tie-downs with unusual thoroughness. They knew where she was going. Ma'am, Rodriguez called out as she approached. Aircraft's ready for departure. Full fuel, medical supplies secured. He paused, wrench still in his hand. Good luck up there. Cassidy nodded. Thanks, Sergeant. Take care of things while I'm gone. She began her pre-flight inspection, running her hands along the aircraft's skin, checking control surfaces and engine intakes. The familiar routine steadied her nerves. Every rivet, every panel had to be perfect. Lives depended on this machine staying in the air. Footsteps approached from behind. She turned to see Captain Drew Mercer walking across the tarmac, fully suited in flight gear, helmet tucked under his arm. Captain Mercer? She straightened up, surprised. What are you doing here? Getting ready to fly escort, ma'am. His young face was set with determination. You taught me that a good pilot never flies alone into hostile territory. Cassidy shook her head. This isn't your mission, Drew. The risk is mine to take. With respect, ma'am, you also taught me to trust my instincts. He gestured toward his F-16 parked nearby. My instincts are telling me to follow my instructor into whatever hell she's walking into. She studied his face, seeing the resolve there. Your career will mean nothing if I let you fly this mission alone and something happens. He stepped closer. Besides, someone needs to keep the enemy fighters off your back while you make that landing. The radio on her flight vest crackled. Valkyrie 01, this is Corporal Briggs. Status update, we've got 2 more kids showing symptoms. How long until you're airborne? Cassidy keyed her mic. Briggs, this is Valkyrie 01. Preparing for departure now. Hold your position. Help is coming. The response came back weak but grateful. Roger, Valkyrie 01. We'll be waiting. General Hayes appeared at the edge of the flight line, his uniform crisp despite the heat. He walked directly toward them, his expression unreadable. Captain Rhodes, he said formally. Then he looked at Mercer. Captain Mercer. I didn't authorize escort for this mission. Mercer stood straighter. Sir, I volunteer for this assignment. The mission parameters suggest. Hayes held up a hand. Captain, 3 years ago this woman saved my nephew's unit during that mountain rescue. 22-year-old Marine, first deployment. His voice softened slightly. Today she's going to save those civilians. Some legends never fade. He turned back to Cassidy. But legends shouldn't fly alone into impossible situations. Hayes pulled out his radio. Control tower, this is General Hayes. Authorize immediate departure for 2 aircraft. Valkyrie 01 primary mission, Falcon 02 providing escort. The tower controller's voice came back surprised. Sir, did you say Valkyrie 01? Affirmative. Valkyrie 01, you are cleared for departure. The surprise in the controller's voice was unmistakable. Around the flight line, ground crew members stopped their work. That call sign hadn't been used officially in 3 years. Mechanics and technicians turned toward their aircraft, suddenly understanding the significance of what they were witnessing. Airman Chin approached with the final maintenance log. Ma'am, she's ready to fly. Brought her some extra luck. He patted the aircraft's nose. This old bird's been waiting for a real mission. Cassidy signed the paperwork and handed it back. Thanks for taking care of her. Rodriguez jogged over from the fuel truck. Ma'am, topped off the tanks personally. She'll get you there and back. Mercer was already walking toward his F-16, calling back over his shoulder. Valkyrie 01, Falcon 02 will be ready for takeoff in 5 minutes. The radio crackled again. Valkyrie 01, this is Control Tower. You are cleared for taxi when ready. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. Weather moving in later tonight. Cassidy climbed into the cockpit and settled into the pilot's seat. The familiar surroundings welcomed her back, instrument panels, switches, and controls exactly where they should be. She ran through her pre-start checklist with practiced efficiency. Outside, ground crew members pulled away the wheel chocks and began their final safety checks. Rodriguez gave her a thumbs up from the ground. Hayes appeared at the cockpit window. Bring them home, Valkyrie. Yes, sir. She flipped the master switches and pressed the engine start buttons. The massive turboprops began their slow rotation, building speed and power. The sound filled the air like rolling thunder. Through her headset, she heard Mercer's voice. Falcon 02, engine starting. Ready to follow you anywhere, ma'am. The engine spun up to full power. The C-130 climbed steadily through clear afternoon sky, Mercer's F-16 maintaining formation off her right wing. Cassidy monitored her instruments while scanning the horizon ahead. The mountains grew larger with each passing minute, their peaks cutting sharp silhouettes against the blue. Valkyrie 01, this is Falcon 02, Mercer's voice came through her headset. Radar contact with multiple aircraft, high altitude. Estimate 6 hostiles in patrol pattern over the target area. Cassidy adjusted her heading slightly. Copy, Falcon. Any ground-based threats? Affirm. Multiple SAM sites active along both ridgelines. They've got overlapping coverage of the entire approach corridor. She studied her navigation display, comparing 2 possible routes. The direct path cuts straight through the mountain pass, 30 minutes flying time but maximum exposure to enemy defenses. The alternative route wound around the eastern peaks, adding another hour to the flight. The radio crackled with static. Valkyrie 01, this is Corporal Briggs. Status update. Go ahead, Briggs. The voice that came back was strained, barely controlled. Ma'am, we just lost our first civilian. 8-year-old girl. Fever took her 20 minutes ago. His voice cracked. Her mother keeps asking when the medicine is coming. Cassidy's grip tightened on the controls. Briggs, I'm en route. Hold your position. We're trying, ma'am. But we've got 3 more kids critical. Adults starting to panic. I don't know how much longer we can keep this together. She looked at her navigation screen again. The longer route meant another hour of flying while people died on the ground. The direct route meant flying through the heart of enemy air defenses. Falcon 02, what's your assessment of enemy air activity? They're maintaining high patrol altitude. Probably haven't detected us yet. But once we enter that valley, we'll be sitting ducks. Cassidy made her decision. She adjusted course toward the direct approach. Falcon, we're taking the straight shot. Those kids don't have time for the scenic route. Roger, Valkyrie. I'll stay high and try to draw their attention when they come for us. The mountains loomed ahead now, their rocky faces scarred with deep ravines and sharp ridges. The entrance to Karazhan Pass opened like a narrow doorway between towering peaks. Multiple radar locks. Mercer's voice came urgent through the radio. SAM sites are tracking us. Missile launch detected. Cassidy banked hard left as a surface-to-air missile streaked past her cockpit window. The C-130 groaned under the violent maneuver, cargo shifting in the back despite the tie-downs. Falcon 02, I've got enemy fighters inbound from the north, Mercer reported. 2 aircraft, closing fast. She pushed the cargo plane lower, using the terrain to mask her approach. Rock walls flashed by her wingtips as she threaded between the peaks. Every instinct screamed that this was insane, flying a lumbering transport through a canyon barely wide enough for fighters. Another missile warning sounded. This time she rolled right, the aircraft's massive bulk protesting every movement. The missile impacted the canyon wall behind them, sending rock fragments bouncing off her fuselage. Valkyrie 01, I'm engaging the fighters, Mercer called out. Keep heading for that landing zone. Through her side window, she saw Mercer's F-16 climb sharply, intercepting 2 enemy aircraft before they could attack her transport. Contrails streaked across the sky as missiles flew in both directions. The radio crackled again, barely audible through the static. Valkyrie 01, this is Briggs. Children are dying, Valkyrie. We need you now. The desperation in his voice cut through all the tactical chatter and missile warnings. She pushed the throttles forward, coaxing every bit of speed from the overloaded aircraft. Briggs, hold on. I'm 5 minutes out. A new missile warning tone filled her cockpit. This one was close, too close. She pulled back on the stick, climbing rapidly as the missile passed underneath. But the violent maneuver stressed systems already pushed to their limits. Red warning lights began flashing across her instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Flight control response sluggish. Hydraulic system failure, she announced over the radio. Primary and backup systems compromised. The aircraft felt different now, heavier, less responsive. Manual flight controls only. Every input required more effort, more anticipation. Valkyrie 01, can you maintain controlled flight? Mercer's voice came between bursts of static as he maneuvered against enemy fighters. Affirm, but landing's going to be interesting. She worked the controls, feeling the aircraft's reluctant response. Falcon, how's your situation? Engaged with 3 hostiles now. More inbound from the east. Another SAM launch. This time she couldn't avoid it completely. The missile detonated close enough to pepper her starboard wing with shrapnel. More warning lights illuminated her panel. Engine 2 running rough, she reported, watching temperature gauges climb toward red lines. But still flying. The narrow canyon began to widen slightly. Through the windscreen, she could see the convoy's position, a cluster of vehicles arranged in a defensive circle on a flat stretch of ground barely long enough for a landing strip. Visual contact with the landing zone, she announced. Beginning final approach. Copy, Valkyrie 01. We see you coming. Briggs' voice carried hope for the first time. Beautiful sight, ma'am. But as she lined up for approach, her hydraulic pressure gauge dropped to 0. The flight controls went completely manual, no power assist, just cables and her own strength fighting against airflow and gravity. Complete hydraulic failure, she reported grimly. This is going to be a dead stick landing. The makeshift landing strip stretched ahead like a scar across the valley floor. Cassidy fought the unresponsive controls, using every ounce of strength to keep the C-130 lined up with the narrow dirt runway. Without hydraulics, the aircraft felt like wrestling a boulder through the air. Valkyrie 01, you're coming in hot, Briggs' voice crackled through her headset. Recommend full flaps for approach. Negative on flaps, Briggs. Manual controls only. I've got what I've got. The ground rushed up faster than she wanted. She pulled back on the stick, fighting to flare the landing. The main gear hit hard, bouncing the massive aircraft back into the air before slamming down again. Dust clouds erupted around the plane as she stood on the brakes. The C-130 rolled to a stop just 50 meters from a pile of boulders marking the end of the improvised runway. Cassidy shut down the engines and wiped sweat from her forehead. She'd made it. Outstanding landing, Valkyrie 01, Briggs called over the radio. We're moving to your position for unloading. Cassidy opened the cargo door as convoy personnel ran toward the aircraft. The first person she saw was Corporal Nathan Briggs himself, a young Marine with dust-covered gear and exhausted eyes. Behind him, other soldiers began pulling medical supplies from the cargo bay. Ma'am, I can't tell you how good it is to see you, Briggs said, extending his hand. I'm Nathan Briggs. We've been talking by radio. She shook his hand firmly. Cassidy Rhodes. How are those kids? Better now that you're here. Dr. Martinez is already setting up the antibiotics. He gestured toward a cluster of civilians huddled near the convoy vehicles. That little girl's mother keeps asking if the medicine came in time for her daughter. Cassidy watched medics rushing supplies toward the civilian area. A woman in a torn dress held a small boy, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. An elderly man sat beside her, coughing violently. They'll make it, she said quietly. That's what matters. Briggs nodded toward her aircraft. Ma'am, we need to get you turned around for departure. Enemy forces are regrouping about 2 kilometers north. As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Small arms fire, getting closer. Valkyrie 01, this is Falcon 02, Mercer's voice came through her radio. Multiple ground vehicles moving toward your position. Estimate company strength force with armor support. Cassidy looked at the unloading operation. Medical supplies were flowing steadily from the cargo bay, but the process would take at least 10 more minutes to complete. How long until they reach us? She asked Briggs. 15 minutes if we're lucky. Maybe less. She watched Dr. Martinez working frantically to administer medicine to the sickest children. The elderly man's coughing had worsened. A teenage girl lay unconscious on a stretcher. Ma'am, we need to go now, Briggs urged. Leave what's left. We can make do. Cassidy shook her head. These people need every dose of medicine in that cargo bay. We finished the job. Gunfire erupted closer now, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of mortars. Convoy Marines took defensive positions around the perimeter. Keep unloading, she ordered, climbing back into the cockpit. I'll get the engine started. The turboprops spun to life as the last cases of medical supplies came off the aircraft. Through her windscreen, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance. Enemy forces were advancing rapidly. Valkyrie 01, all cargo clear. Briggs shouted from outside. You're good to go. She released the brakes and began her takeoff roll. The aircraft accelerated down the dirt strip as bullets began impacting around them. A mortar round exploded 50 meters to her left, showering the aircraft with dirt and rocks. The C-130 lifted off just as enemy vehicles crested the ridge overlooking the valley. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, tracers streaking past her cockpit windows. Something impacted the fuselage with a metallic clang. Then another. The aircraft shuddered as more rounds found their target. Taking fire, she reported over the radio. Multiple impacts on fuselage and wings. A new warning light illuminated her panel. Engine oil pressure on number 3 engine dropping rapidly. Temperature climbing toward red line. Engine failure imminent, she announced, watching the gauges climb dangerously high. Number 3 engine shutting down. She feathered the propeller and shut down fuel flow to the failing engine. The aircraft's performance deteriorated immediately, slower climb rate, heavier control pressure needed. Falcon 02, I'm down to 3 engines and still taking ground fire. Roger, Valkyrie 01. I'm making a strafing run to suppress their positions. Mercer's F-16 screamed overhead, its cannon firing into enemy positions. The ground fire slackened momentarily as hostile forces took cover. But more warning lights were flashing now. Fuel leak detected in the left wing tank. Electrical system showing irregularities. The aircraft had taken more damage than she'd initially realized. Valkyrie 01, you're trailing fuel vapor, Mercer reported grimly. Looks like you've got a significant leak. Cassidy checked her fuel gauges. All tanks showing lower than expected readings. The leak was substantial, fuel streaming from battle damage in her wing. Copy, Falcon. How's it look back there? Enemy forces overrunning the landing zone, but the convoy's moving out. Mission accomplished, ma'am. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The medical supplies had been delivered. Those children would live. Dr. Martinez would have what he needed to treat the sick. But her own situation was deteriorating rapidly. 3 engines instead of 4. Massive fuel leak. Hydraulic systems still completely failed. And they still had to navigate back through hostile territory. Falcon 02, what's our route home? Same way we came in, ma'am. But those SAM sites are still active, and we've got more enemy fighters scrambling to intercept. Another warning buzzer sounded in her cockpit. This time it was the master caution light, multiple systems failing simultaneously. Fuel pumps struggling. Electrical power fluctuating. Even her radio was beginning to fade in and out. The aircraft was dying around her, systems failing one by one from battle damage. But they were airborne and climbing away from the enemy force below. The base runway appeared through the haze of leaking fuel and smoke from the damaged engine. Cassidy gripped the manual flight controls, fighting to keep the wounded C-130 level. 2 engines remained functional, 1 was completely shut down, and the 4th was running rough. Valkyrie 01, this is Control Tower. Declare your emergency status. Tower, Valkyrie 01. Multiple engine failures, complete hydraulic loss, major fuel leak. Requesting emergency landing, runway foam, and crash trucks. Roger, Valkyrie 01. Emergency equipment is standing by. You're cleared for straight-in approach, any runway. Through her cracked windscreen, she could see fire trucks racing into position along the runway. Ambulances followed close behind. Red warning lights flashed across the airfield as the emergency alert sounded. Falcon 02 to tower, escorting Valkyrie 01 to final approach. Mercer's F-16 maintained position off her wing despite the fuel vapor streaming from her aircraft. She's losing altitude fast. The approach felt like flying a falling brick. Without hydraulic assistance, every control input demanded maximum physical effort. Her arms ached from wrestling the unresponsive aircraft through the air. Landing gear down, she announced, pulling the manual extension handles. The wheels locked into position with grinding mechanical sounds instead of smooth hydraulic operation. Valkyrie 01, you're lined up with runway 27. Looking good for approach. The runway grew larger in her windscreen. Emergency foam covered the concrete surface like white carpet. Fire trucks positioned themselves along both sides, crews ready with hoses and rescue equipment. She crossed the runway threshold with barely enough altitude. The main gear touched down hard, bouncing once before settling. Without functioning brakes, she relied on reverse thrust from the remaining engines and aerodynamic drag to slow the massive aircraft. The C-130 rolled to a stop halfway down the runway, trailing steam from overheated components and fuel vapors from the wing damage. Cassidy shut down all engines and sat back in her seat, hands trembling slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. Fire trucks surrounded the aircraft immediately. Ground crews rushed forward with wheel chocks and emergency equipment. Through her side window, she could see mechanics already examining the extensive battle damage. She opened the cockpit door and climbed down to the concrete. The entire squadron stood along the flight line, pilots, crew chiefs, mechanics, and support personnel. They watched in respectful silence as she walked away from the aircraft that had brought her home. General Hayes waited near the operations building, Chief Master Sergeant Ward beside him. Their faces showed relief mixed with professional assessment of what they'd witnessed. Her radio crackled one final time. Valkyrie 01, this is Corporal Briggs. The transmission was distant but clear. Convoy is secure. All civilians stable. Medical treatment proceeding successfully. She keyed her mic copy, Briggs. Glad to hear everyone's okay. Ma'am, I want you to know something. You earned that call sign twice now. First time you saved 47 Marines. Today you saved 200 civilians including 43 children. His voice carried deep respect. Valkyrie 01, you truly decide who lives and dies. And today, you chose life. Hayes approached as she clipped the radio back to her vest. Outstanding work, Captain. Mission accomplished. Behind him, the squadron pilots began walking forward. Major Collins stepped up first. Captain Rhodes, that was exceptional flying. We were wrong to doubt you. Other pilots nodded agreement. Captain Martinez extended his hand. Ma'am, it was an honor to watch a master at work. Mercer jogged over from his F-16, flight helmet under his arm, his young face beaming with pride and admiration. Ma'am, you didn't just teach us to fly. You taught us what it means to serve.